Nobody knew the maid was a Taekwondo master until she protected the billionaire from a robbery. The mansion stretched wide across manicured lawns, its marble columns gleaming beneath the soft glow of the evening lights. Inside, the rooms whispered of wealth. Crystal chandeliers glittered above polished oak floors, velvet drapes framed tall windows, and priceless paintings hung quietly on the walls. Staff moved with practiced silence, their steps careful not to disturb the grandness of the place. Every tray of hors d'oeuvres was carried with elegance. Every polished surface reflected perfection. Among the invisible army of workers was a maid whose presence drew no attention. She had medium brown skin, a smooth complexion, and dark hair tied neatly into a bun that kept it away from her face. Her uniform was simple but immaculate. A black dress pressed clean with a starched white apron tied tightly at her waist. She walked with poise, her black shoes clicking softly against the marble as she carried linens and polished silverware. To most, she was just another quiet figure, a moving shadow in a house full of light. She bent to collect a champagne flute left abandoned on a low table, her hands steady and graceful. Her almond-shaped eyes scanned the room quickly, ensuring everything remained in order. When guests brushed past her, they hardly noticed. To them, she was background, part of the mansion's machinery, no more worthy of attention than the gilded wallpaper or the shining chandeliers. She never raised her voice, never faltered in her tasks, yet beneath the quiet rhythm of her movements lay something no one suspected. Years of discipline shaped her every step. Hidden in the way her body balanced trays and steadied fragile glass was a strength born from training, from hours of repetition that had nothing to do with housework. Her breathing, always controlled, hinted at the calm of someone who had faced far more than dust and dishes. She carried herself not only as a maid but as someone whose muscles remembered combat, whose mind understood vigilance. The other staff had grown used to her silence, taking it as a sign of humility. The guests who glanced her way assumed she was ordinary, a figure with no story beyond service. Even the billionaire who owned the mansion never considered the life behind her steady gaze. She kept her past locked away, folded deep like the linens she placed in drawers, never flaunting what once defined her. The mansion buzzed with talk of business and wealth, laughter echoing through the halls. But she moved quietly, collecting plates, refreshing drinks, adjusting flowers on tables. Every task was carried out with a devotion that masked the truth. To the world around her, she was invisible. To herself, she was both servant and guardian, a woman hiding in plain sight with skills none of them could imagine. No one could have guessed that within the humble black maid, moving unnoticed through the billionaire's grand home, lived a Taekwondo master whose past was waiting for the moment it would no longer stay hidden. The music of the evening drifted through the hall as if it were meant to soften every corner with elegance, but not every sound carried kindness. At the edge of the room, the maid worked quietly, her medium brown skin glowing faintly under the golden chandelier as she placed a fresh napkin beside a crystal glass. She did not look up, did not falter in her duty, even as a cluster of guests near the bar let out low chuckles. Their voices were hushed, but the sharpness of their tone carried clearly enough. "She really thinks she belongs here," one man muttered, his pale face turned just slightly toward her. His navy suit glimmered with subtle pinstripes, and he spoke with the careless arrogance of someone convinced the world bent to his comfort. A woman beside him leaned forward, the pearls at her neck catching the light as she smirked. "Just the help," she whispered, lifting her glass with manicured fingers. "They always look so serious, as if polishing a floor is the same as running this house." Her laughter was light, but cruel. Another guest, younger and eager to impress, joined in. "She doesn't even look at anyone when she works, probably too afraid to make eye contact. She's invisible, and that's exactly where she belongs." His words earned another ripple of quiet laughter. The maid heard every syllable. The whispers might have been intended as private, but the tone was sharp enough to pierce through her focus. Still, she did not break stride. She lifted the tray from the table, balancing its weight with practiced ease, her posture steady. Her almond-shaped eyes remained calm, lowered in composure rather than defeat. In the corner, Two senior staff members passed by, their expressions tight with disdain, not for the guests, but for her. One muttered that she ought to move faster, that her pace made them look bad. The other sneered that she had better remember her place, because no one would protect her if she slipped. They spoke as though she were not there, as though she were a piece of furniture rather than a person. The maid bowed her head gently, not in submission but in control. She swallowed the sting of the insult, letting it sink into the quiet strength that always anchored her. Her hands did not shake. Her steps did not falter. She carried herself as if the words were weightless, though she knew well that they were not. Around her, the hall glowed with wealth, the guests laughing and toasting as though cruelty was just another form of entertainment. Yet, in the calm curve of her shoulders and the unwavering steadiness of her breath, there was something none of them could see. They believed she had no place in their world of power and wealth. They could not imagine the world she had once belonged to, or the power she carried silently within. The gala had been arranged to dazzle. Crystal chandeliers rained golden light across the ballroom, violins played a sweet melody, and polished silver trays carried glasses of champagne that caught the glow of the candles flickering on each table. Guests in satin gowns and tailored tuxedos laughed freely, their voices blending into a sound of comfort and wealth. The billionaire himself moved from table to table, his smile practiced, his presence commanding but pleasant. Staff lined the walls, moving like shadows, ensuring every surface gleamed and every glass remained full. The maid worked near the edge of the room, her black uniform crisp, her white apron neatly tied at the back. Her almond-shaped eyes flickered from table to table as she collected an empty plate, balancing it effortlessly. Though whispers of cruelty still lingered from earlier, she stayed calm, her movements steady. The music swelled, a toast was called, and crystal glasses were raised high. For a moment, the room seemed untouchable, a world of power and privilege sealed off from danger. Then the sound came sharp, metallic, violent. The heavy doors at the far end of the hall burst open, crashing against the walls. The violins screeched to a halt. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a group of masked figures stormed inside. Their boots struck the marble floor with force, their gloved hands gripping weapons that gleamed under the chandelier light. Screams erupted at once. The laughter died instantly, replaced by chaos. Guests scrambled to their feet, chairs tipping and clattering. A woman's pearls snapped, scattering across the floor as she stumbled back. Staff scattered to the corners, pressing themselves against the walls, trays dropping with a crash of glass. The music ended in silence, broken only by the shouts of the intruders. "Money, jewelry, everything now!" one of the masked men barked, his voice rough and commanding. Another waved his weapon toward the tables. His eyes narrowed through the black cloth covering his face. The glittering gowns and tailored suits no longer mattered. In an instant, the powerful were reduced to trembling figures clutching at their possessions. The billionaire stood near the center of the room, his shoulders stiff, his eyes wide. A masked robber shoved him roughly, forcing him backward until his body pressed against the polished wood of the table. "You, old man," the intruder snarled. "You've got the most. Empty your pockets or you're finished." The guests looked on in horror as their host, the man they had admired for his wealth, froze under the threat. His lips parted, but no words came. His face turned pale, his body rigid, trapped in fear. The maid, still in the corner of the room with a tray clutched to her chest, stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the unfolding chaos. Guests shrieked, clutching rings, earrings, and watches, tossing them into hastily grabbed sacks as the robbers demanded more. The billionaire's family huddled together, their cries muffled by the thick air of terror. The once glittering gala had become a nightmare, and the mansion's grand ballroom was no longer a place of wealth and laughter but a prison held by masked hands. And yet, hidden in the edges of the room, the calm gaze of the maid lingered, watching, waiting. Her posture remained straight, her breathing steady, as if she saw the chaos differently than the others. The ballroom had fallen into chaos, its glittering light dimmed by fear. Guests clutched each other in corners, jewels and watches piled hastily into the robbers' sacks. The staff huddled against the walls, their heads bowed, their hands trembling. Yet the worst moment came when one of the masked men turned his attention squarely on the billionaire. He shoved him hard in the chest, sending the older man stumbling back against the table. A gasp echoed across the room as crystal goblets toppled and shattered against the floor. The robber pressed the barrel of his weapon against the billionaire's chest, so close the fabric of his tailored suit dented inward. "You think you're untouchable?" the man snarled, his voice low and dangerous. The billionaire's lips trembled, his face drained of color, his hands lifted helplessly into the air. He tried to speak, but no sound came, only a strangled whimper that betrayed his fear. The billionaire's family cried out in horror. His wife reached forward as if to shield him, but another robber barked at her to sit back down. His daughter's scream cut through the stillness, shrill with terror, while the staff whispered frantic prayers under their breath. Not one of them moved closer. Fear had them frozen where they stood, paralyzed by the gleam of steel and the darkness of those masked faces. In the back of the hall, the maid stood, with her hands clasped in front of her. The silver tray still balanced carefully against her hip, her eyes fixed on the billionaire, then on his family, then on the trembling staff who could do nothing. She felt the pulse of her own heart steadying, her breath falling into the rhythm she had once trained for long before life had brought her into uniforms and aprons. For too long she had swallowed insults, pretended to be smaller than she was, hidden her past beneath humility. But as the robber's voice grew harsher and the barrel pressed closer, she realized the time for hiding was over. Her almond-shaped eyes sharpened, a spark of resolve flickering in their depths. She took one slow step forward, then another, her movements quiet, unnoticed amid the cries of fear. No one saw her shift her weight. No one noticed the way her posture straightened. The years of Taekwondo, the hours of discipline, the fights and competitions that had once defined her life, all of it returned to her in silence. She exhaled deeply, unclasping her hands. For the first time that night, her role as a servant slipped away. She was no longer invisible. She was ready, and the decision had been made. The robber pressed the weapon harder into the billionaire's chest, the room shrinking into a single moment of terror. Then, as if the air itself shifted, the maid moved. Her black shoes skimmed the marble floor with sudden speed, her tray clattering against the wall as she dropped it without hesitation. Gasps echoed, but before anyone could speak, she had already struck. Her arm cut through the air, snapping the robber's wrist with precise force. The weapon clattered uselessly onto the table, sliding past crystal glasses that shattered as it fell. Before the man could react, she pivoted, her leg rising in a sharp, flawless kick that sent him sprawling onto the ground. His mask shifted, exposing stunned eyes as he groaned in shock. Another attacker lunged, raising his own weapon. She turned swiftly, her stance grounded, her hands rising in perfect form. She blocked his strike with a sharp crack of forearm against wrist, then spun, driving her elbow into his ribs with surgical precision. He stumbled backward, clutching himself as his breath wheezed out. A third rushed her, but she dropped low, sweeping his legs out from under him. He crashed to the floor with a heavy thud, the chandelier light scattering across his mask as he groaned in pain. The ballroom froze. Guests who had screamed only moments earlier now stood still, their mouths open, their eyes locked on the figure in the crisp black dress and white apron. The staff pressed against the walls stared in disbelief, unable to reconcile the quiet maid they had always dismissed with the fierce fighter now standing tall in the middle of the chaos. Even the billionaire's family, huddled in terror only a moment ago, looked at her with awe, their cries silenced by the sudden surge of power radiating from her. One robber, desperate, lunged with a clumsy strike, but she intercepted him easily. Her arm snapped upward, deflecting the blow, her knee rising to meet his chest. He collapsed, the sound of his fall echoing like a drumbeat across the silent room. She adjusted her stance, her breathing calm, her eyes sharp, her body balanced as if the years of discipline had never left her. The final masked man hesitated, his courage evaporating. He stepped backward, his hands trembling as he weighed his chances. She did not chase him. She simply straightened, her posture both calm and commanding, her gaze fixed on him until he dropped his weapon and fled toward the door. Silence stretched long after the last robber had fallen or fled. The music had long since died, the chandeliers above glittering as though mocking the fear that had consumed the room. Every face turned toward her. The maid who had been invisible for so long now standing at the center like a warrior reborn. She inhaled slowly, her chest rising, her dark eyes calm but fierce. The billionaire pressed a hand to his chest, his knees weak, his voice shaking with disbelief. "She saved us," he whispered, and the words spread like a spark. The ballroom, once broken by terror, now stood united in stunned reverence for the woman who had revealed herself at last. The robbers lay scattered across the marble floor, their masks torn, their weapons useless. Some clutched their ribs, groaning with pain. Others sat stunned against the walls, their bravado completely stripped away. The glittering ballroom, once filled with terror, was eerily quiet except for the faint sounds of injured men trying to catch their breath. Guests who had ducked behind tables slowly began to rise, their gowns and suits rumpled, their eyes wide in disbelief. The chandeliers continued to glow overhead as though mocking the chaos that had just unfolded. Security rushed in moments later, the heavy thud of their boots echoing through the grand hall. They quickly restrained the subdued intruders, locking cuffs around their wrists and dragging them upright. The groans of the robbers grew louder as they were forced to their feet, no longer the predators of the night, but broken figures exposed for what they truly were. The guests whispered frantically among themselves. Their voices trembled with awe as they pointed to the maid standing calmly at the center of it all. She was no longer the invisible servant they had dismissed, no longer the figure mocked in hushed tones. She stood tall, her black uniform immaculate despite the fight, her chest rising steadily as though she had not just saved every soul in the room. Faces that had turned away from her earlier now stared openly, wide-eyed, unable to reconcile what they had seen with who they had believed her to be. Some of the very people who had mocked her now struggled to find words. They stared, their lips parted, unable to speak, their arrogance silenced by the memory of her precise movements, the sight of trained skill that had protected them when they had been powerless. The whispers spread quickly, questions carried from one guest to another. Who was she really? Where had she learned to fight like that? How long had she hidden such strength? At the head of the room, the billionaire struggled to his feet. His expensive suit was wrinkled from the shove, his chest still heaving from the pressure of the weapon that had been aimed at his heart. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he steadied himself on the table. When his eyes found her, however, they filled not with fear but with awe. He looked at her as though seeing her for the very first time. She turned her gaze toward him, her dark almond-shaped eyes calm but firm. For a moment, neither spoke. The room around them seemed to fade, the whispers falling into background noise. Then, with a voice still shaking from what had nearly been his end, he whispered his gratitude. "You saved me." The words were soft, almost fragile, but they carried the weight of truth. The guests heard him, and silence rippled across the hall. Every eye returned to the maid. Every thought rewound to the moment when she had moved faster than their fear. In that silence, she was no longer just the help. She was a protector, a guardian, and the embodiment of dignity they had failed to see. And though she said nothing, her posture, her stillness, spoke louder than any answer could. True worth was never defined by uniform or title, but by the courage and grace revealed when the world needed it most. The ballroom remained hushed, long after the intruders had been taken away, the guests still shaken by the violence and even more by the revelation that the quiet maid had saved them all. Security lingered at the edges of the hall. The billionaire sat pale but alive at the head of the room, and the guests whispered as though afraid to break the spell of what had just occurred. Their eyes never left her, the woman they had dismissed as invisible, who now stood at the center of the most unbelievable story. It was one of the younger guests who asked aloud what everyone else had been thinking. Who was she really? The question traveled across the floor until it reached the billionaire, who repeated it with gentle urgency. The maid lowered her gaze at first, her hands folded once more in front of her, but the silence waited for her answer. Finally, she spoke with a calm voice, explaining what no one could have imagined. She had trained in martial arts since she was a child. Years of discipline had taken her across the world, and she had competed internationally, standing on stages before crowds who cheered her strength and skill. Life had changed, pulling her away from those arenas. Circumstances, responsibilities, and hardships had drawn her into quieter work, into the uniform she now wore. But the training had never left her. The strength had never dimmed. The hall filled with stunned faces, their mouths slightly open, their eyes searching her as if they were seeing her for the first time. Staff members, who had walked past her every day with barely a glance, now bowed their heads, humbled by the knowledge that they had overlooked a woman of extraordinary ability. Guests who had mocked her in whispers struggled with their own shame, remembering cruel words that now burned like hot coals against their pride. The billionaire, his hands still trembling, rose to his feet with difficulty. His eyes filled with gratitude, his voice thick as he thanked her not only for saving his life, but for reminding everyone present that true worth is never written in wealth, or stitched into a uniform, or measured by status. The applause began softly, hesitant at first, but then grew, filling the grand ballroom with a sound that carried dignity rather than arrogance. From that night forward, the story spread like fire. Guests retold it at dinner tables, staff whispered it in hallways, and soon it became legend beyond the mansion. They spoke of the evening when robbers invaded a glittering gala and a maid, unnoticed by most, revealed herself as a warrior who protected a billionaire's life with courage and precision. They spoke of how the rich and powerful learned humility that night, and how the woman they had overlooked stood taller than all of them. It was remembered not just as the night the billionaire survived, but as the night the world was reminded that greatness hides in places no one bothers to look, and that dignity and strength can shine even through the simplest of uniforms.